I have been to many family gatherings, but none ever felt as suffocating as the one that evening. The chandeliers cast a golden glow across the long dining table, where silver cutlery clinked softly against porcelain plates. My aunt's voice, always a sharp whisper of disapproval, hovered in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. I kept my smile polite, sipping at my glass of wine, but inside my chest, my heart pounded with an anticipation I couldn't explain. The family business had always been the silent guest at these dinners, uninvited yet impossible to ignore. My father's absence loomed heavy, though it had been 2 years since his death. Every corner of the house still carried his presence, and that presence seemed to challenge Aunt Margaret's every move. She hated me for inheriting even his spirit, though at that moment I had no proof just how deep her hatred went. Margaret sat opposite me, her posture rigid, her hands adorned with glimmering rings that caught the light every time she gestured. She was a woman built on power, sharp cheekbones, sharper eyes, and an expression carved into permanent disdain. My cousin Ethan, seated beside her, avoided my gaze, choosing instead to stir his drink absent-mindedly as if pretending not to sense the tension between his mother and me. My brother Daniel sat to my right, his hand brushing mine occasionally, a small comfort in the sea of hostility. Conversations rose and fell around us, but none of them mattered. Beneath the laughter, beneath the pretense of family warmth, I could feel the air heavy with something unspoken. Margaret's eyes flicked to me more than once, cold and deliberate, as if rehearsing the moment she was about to unleash. I thought back to the last gathering we had after my father's funeral, where Margaret had whispered in my ear that I was naive to think I'd ever belong in the boardroom. Her words had stuck to me like poison, but I buried them deep, telling myself that time would dull their sting. Yet here she was, her lips tightening every time I lifted my fork, her breath catching in controlled impatience as if she were counting down to something. I couldn't tell if she was jealous of me, or simply determined to erase me from the family's future. The legacy of my father's company, the empire he built from nothing, was at the heart of it all. I knew she believed it should have been hers. I had no idea what she was about to do, only that her silence was too sharp to last. The laughter at the far end of the table dimmed, replaced by that peculiar hush that falls when someone unexpected takes charge. Margaret pushed back her chair with a deliberate scrape, the sound cutting through the room. Her glass clinked against the table as she stood, shoulders squared, chin raised. All eyes turned toward her, some curious, others wary, but none prepared for the venom in her voice. She didn't look at anyone but me as she began to speak, her words slow, crisp, and dripping with disdain. I felt the prickling on the back of my neck, a warning that this moment would change everything. Her voice carried, commanding silence without needing to ask for it. "Chloe," she said, my name stretched out like a curse. "You sit here as though you are one of us, as though you have earned the right to lead. But let me make something clear tonight, in front of every soul present." She paused, letting the suspense settle, her eyes gleaming in satisfaction as the table leaned in. My breath caught in my throat, Daniel's hand tightened on mine, and I felt the room closing in around me. Then the words fell like stones. "You will never control this family business." The gasp around the table was audible, a ripple of disbelief moving from one end to the other. Forks clattered to plates, whispers rose like the wind before a storm, but my aunt's gaze never wavered. It was locked on me, drilling into me, savoring the blow she had just delivered. For a moment, I felt stripped bare, as if she had torn away not only my father's legacy, but also my right to dream of it. Margaret's smile was thin, satisfied, a woman who believed she had finally won. And for a fleeting second, I believed her. But then something shifted inside me, something my father had instilled long ago in the quiet moments when it was just the two of us. His voice echoed in my memory, telling me that strength wasn't in shouting louder than others, but in standing firm when they tried to silence you. I lifted my chin, though my hands trembled beneath the tablecloth. The room was still buzzing, every face turned toward me, waiting to see if I would shatter or if I would rise. Margaret thought she had ended the conversation before it began, but what she didn't know was that she had only lit the fire I had been trying to contain. Daniel whispered, "Don't say anything, not yet," but I ignored him. My silence would only feed Margaret's victory. My eyes locked on hers, and for the first time that evening, I didn't see just her arrogance. I saw her fear. Fear that I might be stronger than she allowed herself to believe. I knew then that her declaration was not confidence, but desperation. She had stood in front of the entire family, not to secure her power, but because she was losing her grip on it. That realization sent a current of calm through me, even as my heart pounded in my chest. As I finally opened my mouth to speak, I realized the whole room was holding its breath. Every cousin, uncle, and sibling sat frozen, caught between two women whose battle lines had just been drawn in plain sight. I had no script, no prepared words, only the steady fire rising within me. But before I could respond, Margaret leaned closer over the table, her voice low but cutting, like the hiss of a blade through silk. "You are your father's daughter," she whispered, "but you will not be his heir." Those words, soft yet merciless, cut deeper than her public declaration. They weren't just about the company. They were about erasing me from the very bloodline I carried with pride. My stomach twisted, my breath shallow, but my resolve hardened. If Margaret thought she had silenced me, she was wrong. She had only confirmed what I already suspected, that she feared the truth my father had left behind. And in that moment, I knew I would stop at nothing to find it. The dining room had become unbearably still after Margaret's declaration. Even the crackle of the fireplace seemed to falter as though the house itself were holding its breath. I could feel dozens of eyes drilling into me, waiting to see how I would respond, whether I would fight back or fold under the humiliation. My hand trembled around the stem of my glass, but I refused to let it slip. I thought of my father again, of how he had always told me to carry myself with dignity even when others sought to tear me down. That dignity was the only weapon I had in that moment, standing defenseless against my aunt's cruelty. My silence, however, was not weakness. It was strategy. Though the tension in my chest made it hard to breathe, Margaret's smirk lingered in the air like poison, feeding on the discomfort of the others. She had chosen her timing perfectly, unveiling her attack in front of the entire family, leaving me little room to retreat without looking defeated. Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside her, his eyes darting to me and then away again, as if he couldn't bear to witness the cruelty, but lacked the courage to intervene. Daniel leaned close, whispering, "Stay calm. Don't let her see you break." His voice anchored me, but I could feel the cracks forming under the weight of so many watching eyes. All my life, Margaret had tried to belittle me, but tonight she wasn't just questioning my worth. She was trying to strip me of my future. As I looked around the table, I caught glimpses of divided loyalties. Some family members averted their eyes, unwilling to take sides, while others looked at me with pity, their silence screaming louder than words. My Uncle Richard, my father's brother, studied me with an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between sympathy and calculation. My cousin Claire bit her lip, her knuckles white around her fork, as if she wanted to speak, but knew the consequences of defying Margaret. I realized then that this wasn't just about me. It was about everyone at that table, trapped under Margaret's shadow, each of them too frightened or too weary to challenge her dominance. The clink of Margaret's glass against the table jolted me from my thoughts. "You see?" she said, her voice dripping with triumph. Not a word. She knows I'm right. Her laugh, brittle, hollow, echoed in the room, making my blood boil. I wanted to scream, to tell her she was wrong, to remind her that my father built this company with his bare hands, and that his blood ran in my veins, not hers. But the words wouldn't form. My silence wasn't cowardice. It was rage that threatened to consume me if I let it spill uncontrolled. And in that moment, I understood why Margaret hated me so fiercely. I wasn't weak. I was the one thing she could never control. Daniel suddenly cleared his throat, breaking the suffocating silence. "Enough," he said firmly, his voice steady, though his hand still gripped mine under the table. "This isn't the time or the place." His eyes locked with Margaret's, and for the first time I saw her falter, just slightly, as if Daniel's defiance had unsettled her. But she recovered quickly, her lips curling into a thin smile. "Of course, Daniel," she said sweetly, though venom still coated every syllable. "Perhaps another time then." Her words sent a shiver through me. She wasn't finished. Tonight had only been the opening move. After dinner ended, the family dispersed slowly, the weight of what had been said still heavy in the air. Conversations were hushed, eyes avoided mine, and no one dared to approach me directly. Margaret moved through the room like a queen who had already claimed victory, her laughter louder than before, her gestures more dramatic. Daniel and I slipped away to the study, the quiet sanctuary my father once used as his office. Closing the door behind us, Daniel exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "She's trying to break you," he said, his voice low. "But you can't let her. You have to fight back, Chloe." His words were both a warning and a challenge. I walked to the bookshelves lining the study, running my fingers over the spines of the leather-bound volumes my father had treasured. The scent of old paper and wood filled the air, grounding me. "Fight back with what?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "She has everyone on her side. The board listens to her. Even half the family is too afraid to stand against her." Daniel turned me to face him, his eyes fierce. "She has influence, but she doesn't have proof. Dad left something. I know he did. Records, evidence, something that secures your place. We just have to find it." His conviction sparked something in me, a fragile flicker of hope that I hadn't felt since my father's death. Memories flooded back of the nights I spent in this very room with my father, watching him pore over documents late into the evening, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had always been meticulous, protective of what he built. If there was evidence, as Daniel believed, it had to be hidden somewhere close, perhaps even here in this room. But as I scanned the shelves and drawers, all I felt was the crushing weight of doubt. What if Margaret was right? What if my father had left nothing, trusting me to stand on my own, a battle I could never win against her ruthless ambition? Daniel squeezed my shoulder, grounding me again. "Don't let her words sink into you, Chloe. That's what she wants. She thrives on fear, on making you question yourself. But you are Dad's daughter. You have his strength, his vision. She knows that. That's why she's terrified of you." I wanted to believe him, but my chest still felt hollow, bruised by Margaret's cruelty. Yet somewhere deep inside, a spark ignited. I wasn't ready to give up. Margaret had declared war in front of the family, and whether I liked it or not, I had to respond. This wasn't just about a company anymore. It was about proving that I belonged, not to her, but to the legacy my father left behind. And as I looked back at Daniel, I made a silent promise to myself. I would find whatever it was my father had left for me. Evidence, letters, records, anything that would silence Margaret's venom once and for all. She believed she had crushed me tonight, but she had only awakened something far more dangerous. For the first time since his death, I felt my father's presence not just as a memory, but as a force guiding me forward. And with that, I knew this was only the beginning of a battle that would consume us all. The following morning, the house was eerily quiet, as though the walls themselves were recovering from the storm Margaret had unleashed the night before. I woke early, unable to shake the heavy words that echoed in my mind. "You will never control this family business." They played on a loop, digging deeper into my skin with every passing second. I moved through the halls barefoot, the polished floors cold against my feet, and paused at the study door. Something about this room pulled me back, a magnetic reminder that my father's presence lingered within these walls. I hesitated, hand resting on the brass handle, knowing that stepping inside would mean confronting both memories and secrets. The study smelled of leather, cedar, and faint traces of my father's cologne, as though time had preserved this space just for me. Dust motes floated in the early morning light, and the silence pressed against me like an unspoken challenge. I began opening drawers, pulling out folders, leafing through stacks of documents that felt endless, but ordinary. Contracts, shareholder agreements, letters addressed to board members, all meticulously organized, but none of them revealing the hidden safeguard Daniel believed existed. With each passing minute, frustration grew heavier, and the walls felt closer. What if we were chasing ghosts? Illusions of security my father never intended to leave. Daniel entered quietly, carrying 2 mugs of coffee, his hair tousled and his shirt wrinkled from the restless night. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, setting the cups down. His attempt at a smile was gentle, but it didn't mask the worry etched on his face. "She'll move fast, Chloe. Margaret won't wait long before she tightens her grip even more. If there's something here, we have to find it soon." His urgency was contagious, feeding the anxiety that already gnawed at me. We worked together in silence, rifling through every drawer, examining books for hollowed spaces, even tapping the wood panels for secret compartments. Still, nothing. The study mocked us with its silence. Hours slipped away, and the sun climbed higher, turning the room uncomfortably warm. I sat back in my father's chair, the leather creaking beneath me, and closed my eyes, exhausted. My father's voice returned to me in fragments, the bedtime stories he used to tell, the lessons about trust, the warnings about ambition. One phrase repeated in my mind, one I hadn't thought about in years. "If you want to understand a person, look not at what they show you, but what they hide." My eyes snapped open. What was Margaret hiding? And what had my father hidden from her? Suddenly, It wasn't just about finding documents. It was about understanding the web of secrets woven around this family. That afternoon, Margaret arrived unannounced, her heels clicking against the marble floors like a declaration of power. She didn't knock before entering the study, simply swept in with Ethan at her side, her smile sharp and rehearsed. "Ah, the little heir," she cooed, glancing at the papers scattered across the desk. "Playing office, are we?" Her presence was suffocating, her perfume cloying as it filled the room. Ethan lingered in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his gaze lingering on me for a second too long. There was something in his eyes, not loyalty to Margaret, but perhaps a flicker of doubt, a secret he didn't dare voice. Margaret leaned against the desk, her crimson nails tapping a slow rhythm on the wood. "You're wasting your time," she said softly, almost kindly, but the venom lay just beneath. "If your father had intended for you to lead, he would have made it clear, but he didn't, because deep down, he knew you weren't ready. You'll destroy everything he built if you try." Her words stung, but beneath the cruelty, I heard something else, fear. Margaret wouldn't be here, wouldn't bother to taunt me, if she were certain of her control. Her need to convince me of my inadequacy was its own confession. She wasn't as untouchable as she pretended. Daniel stepped closer, his arm brushing mine, a silent act of defiance. "We'll see about that," he said firmly, his voice steady. Margaret's eyes narrowed, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the sharp edge beneath. "Careful, Daniel," she warned, her tone suddenly cold. "You wouldn't want to get caught on the wrong side of this war." With that, she turned on her heel, sweeping out of the room, her perfume lingering like smoke after a fire. Ethan hesitated, his eyes meeting mine again, almost apologetic, before he followed her. That fleeting look burned into me, leaving behind more questions than answers. As the door closed behind them, I sank back into the chair, trembling from the encounter. "She's scared," Daniel whispered, pacing the room. "That's why she came. She knows something's here, something she doesn't want us to find. And if she's scared, that means we're closer than we think." His words reignited the flicker of hope inside me. But hope wasn't enough. Margaret's power grew with every day that passed, and if we didn't uncover my father's safeguard soon, I risked losing everything. Still, I clung to Daniel's conviction like a lifeline, because I needed to believe my father had left me something, anything. That night, long after Daniel had gone to bed, I returned to the study alone, a single lamp casting golden light across the room. My eyes scanned the shelves again, this time with a different focus. Not for legal papers or contracts, but for clues, symbols, or codes my father might have hidden in plain sight. My fingers paused on an old leather journal tucked between volumes of law books. It looked unremarkable, worn with age, but something about it drew me in. As I pulled it free and flipped it open, my breath caught. Inside were pages filled not with daily notes, but with careful, deliberate entries, cryptic messages that hinted at secrets buried deeper than I had ever imagined. And in that moment, I knew the war with Margaret had only just begun. I spent nearly an hour staring at the journal in my lap before daring to truly read its contents. The handwriting was unmistakably my father's, precise, slanted, with letters that carried an elegance I had always admired. But the words were not gentle reflections or affectionate notes. They were coded phrases, cryptic references to meetings, agreements, and betrayals I could barely make sense of. Phrases like, "Trust buried is safer than trust declared," and "The ledger hides the truth Margaret seeks." My chest tightened with every line, as though my father had known this day would come, as though he had written these entries for me. Yet fear clawed at me. What if I misinterpreted everything and lost the last chance to honor his legacy? The next morning, I spread the journal across the desk, the lamplight still burning from the sleepless night. Daniel entered, rubbing his eyes, and froze when he saw the open pages. "What's that?" he whispered, stepping closer. His hands hovered above the fragile leather cover as if touching it would shatter something sacred. I explained what I had found, reading aloud the most puzzling passages. Daniel's brow furrowed, his mind already turning the phrases into possibilities. "This isn't just a diary," he said at last. "It's a map, but he's hidden the landmarks. If we can decode this, we'll find whatever Margaret fears most." His certainty gave me strength, though a creeping unease lingered beneath it. We decided to search for the ledger mentioned in the journal, though we had no idea where to begin. The house was large, with countless rooms that held my father's artifacts, collections, and archives. but something told me the answer wasn't hidden in plain sight. He would have placed it where only someone who truly knew him could look. As we walked through the corridors, I remembered childhood afternoons spent playing hide-and-seek with him. He had a mischievous side, always hiding treasures in unexpected places, behind false walls, inside hollowed-out books, even beneath the floorboards of my old playroom. That memory sparked something in me, and I knew we were closer than I dared believe. While Daniel searched the basement archives, I wandered into the library, the largest room in the house aside from the dining hall. The towering shelves loomed over me, filled with books that smelled of dust and history. My fingers skimmed the spines, stopping at volumes I remembered him reading aloud when I was a child. One in particular, a heavy leather-bound book of poetry, caught my attention. It looked ordinary, its spine faded, its pages yellowed, but when I pulled it from the shelf, it felt heavier than it should. My heart pounded as I flipped it open, and sure enough, hidden within its hollowed pages was a small brass key, gleaming faintly in the dim light. When Daniel returned, I showed him the key, my hands trembling. He examined it closely, his expression thoughtful. "This is no ordinary key. Look at the engraving," he pointed out, tracing the faint initials carved into the metal. ALC, my father's full name, Arthur Leonard Caldwell. My throat tightened as tears stung my eyes. He had left this for me, his daughter, not for Margaret or anyone else. "It must open something important," Daniel said, his voice low with urgency. "But where?" We scoured the study again, searching for a hidden lock, a drawer, or even a compartment in the desk. Hours passed with no luck, the key burning in my palm like a promise I couldn't yet fulfill. By evening, frustration gnawed at me. I slumped into the leather chair, staring at the shelves, the desk, the very walls, searching for something I missed. Daniel sat across from me, equally exhausted, when his eyes suddenly flickered to the fireplace. "Wait," he said. He stood, running his hands along the carved mantelpiece. Then he pressed against one of the wooden panels, and a faint click echoed in the silence. My breath caught as a hidden drawer slid open just beneath the hearth. Inside lay a small, locked box, tarnished with age but sturdy, as though it had guarded its contents for decades. The key fit perfectly, clicking with finality as I turned it. The box creaked open, and inside lay a thick ledger, its leather cover cracked but intact. My hands shook as I lifted it, the weight of it far heavier than its size. On the first page, I found my father's familiar handwriting once again, this time clear and deliberate. "To my daughter, Chloe. If you are reading this, it means you are ready. Trust no one until you have uncovered the truth." Tears blurred my vision as I turned the pages, each one filled with financial records, secret transactions, and detailed notes about Margaret's schemes. He had known. He had documented everything, and he had left it for me, his final act of love and trust. But even as relief washed over me, a sharp knock at the door jolted me upright. Daniel and I exchanged alarmed glances before he quickly closed the ledger and slid it back into the box. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. When I opened the door, Ethan stood there, his expression tense. His eyes darted between me and Daniel, as if he knew we were hiding something. "Margaret wants to see you," he said flatly, though his voice carried an edge of hesitation. Something about the way he looked at me, the flicker of conflict in his gaze, made me wonder if he suspected we had found the very evidence that could destroy her. I nodded slowly, forcing calm into my voice, though my heart raced. "Tell her I'll be there shortly." Ethan's eyes lingered on me for a heartbeat longer before he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall. As soon as he disappeared, I locked the box and clutched it tightly to my chest. Daniel placed his hand over mine, steadying me. "This changes everything," he whispered, and he was right. But with the ledger in my possession, the stakes had risen higher than ever. Margaret would stop at nothing to keep her secrets buried, and now I held the key to unearthing them. Walking down the corridor toward Margaret's study felt like walking into the lion's den. The walls that had once felt safe and familiar now loomed over me like silent witnesses to betrayal. I clutched the locked box under my arm, hidden beneath my shawl, its weight pressing against me as though reminding me of the danger I carried. Every step echoed on the marble floor, my mind racing with the knowledge that Margaret would sense any hesitation. She had a way of looking at you, of piercing through facades, and I had to ensure mine didn't falter. Daniel trailed close behind, his presence a silent anchor in the storm of my dread. Margaret's study door was already ajar, as though she had been waiting for me. Inside, the room was dimly lit, with only the flicker of a single lamp casting shadows across her sharp features. She sat behind the heavy oak desk, her hands folded neatly, her eyes cold and assessing. "Chloe," she said, her voice deceptively calm, "how good of you to come." The way she emphasized good sent a chill through me, as though she already knew I was holding something back. I swallowed hard, forcing my face into a mask of composure, though my pulse thudded in my throat. "I wanted to speak with you," she continued, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of authority. "This family has lived in balance for decades, and now that your father is gone, that balance must be maintained." Her words, veiled in civility, carried the sharpness of a blade. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You were always his favorite, weren't you? He trusted you, perhaps more than he should have." My grip on the box tightened beneath the shawl. Margaret's gaze felt like fire against my skin, and I feared she could see straight through me to the ledger hidden within. Daniel cleared his throat gently, trying to divert her attention. "We're all here to honor Mr. Caldwell's wishes," he said carefully. Margaret's eyes flicked to him, a brief spark of disdain flashing across her face before she returned her gaze to me. "Of course," she said smoothly, though her tone suggested anything but agreement. "But honoring his wishes is not the same as clinging to fantasies. The business requires leadership, and I intend to ensure it falls into the right hands." "Do you really believe you are prepared for that responsibility, Chloe?" Her words struck me, not as a question, but as a challenge meant to break me. I steadied my breath, recalling the pages of the ledger, the undeniable proof of her schemes. For the first time, I felt something shift within me, a courage born not of defiance, but of justice. "I believe my father trusted me for a reason," I said, meeting her gaze directly. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Margaret's eyes narrowed further, a shadow of something unreadable crossing her face. Was it doubt, fear, or just another layer of calculation? Whatever it was, I knew I had touched a nerve. Ethan suddenly entered the room, his presence startling both Daniel and me. He avoided my eyes, speaking directly to Margaret. "The board will convene tomorrow to discuss the transfer of leadership," he announced, his tone clipped and professional. Margaret nodded in satisfaction, as though she had orchestrated the timing herself. But when Ethan's gaze briefly flickered toward me, I caught a subtle hesitation, a flicker of something he couldn't quite mask. It wasn't loyalty to Margaret I saw in his eyes. It was conflict, and perhaps even a plea for me to be cautious. That silent exchange lingered with me more than his words. Margaret dismissed us with a flick of her hand, her voice sharp now. "Rest well tonight, Chloe. Tomorrow will be decisive." As Daniel and I stepped back into the corridor, I exhaled, finally releasing the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands trembled beneath the shawl, clutching the box tighter than ever. "She knows," I whispered, my voice breaking slightly. Daniel placed his hand on my shoulder, steadying me. "She suspects," he corrected gently, "but she doesn't know for certain, and that means we still have the advantage, for now." His calmness grounded me, but the dread lingered. Tomorrow was coming too quickly. Back in the safety of my room, I placed the box beneath the floorboard, where I had hidden treasures as a child. It felt almost poetic, using the same secret spot my father had once helped me create. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, wondering how much strength I had left. The ledger was proof, but proof meant nothing unless I had the courage to wield it in front of everyone. Daniel sat beside me, his hand covering mine, his voice low and steady. "We can do this," he said. "Your father believed in you, and so do I." His faith was the only thing holding me together. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay awake, my mind replaying Margaret's words, her eyes, her power. Every creak of the house set me on edge. Every shadow seemed to move. I rose at one point, pacing the room, clutching the shawl as though it could shield me. The weight of responsibility pressed harder than ever, and I felt both terrified and strangely exhilarated. My father had prepared me for this moment, even if I hadn't realized it. Tomorrow, the family would gather, the board would speak, and Margaret would try to silence me. But I had the ledger, and with it, I carried the truth. The morning of the board meeting arrived cloaked in a heaviness I could feel deep in my bones. The mansion was eerily quiet, as if even the walls anticipated the storm about to break. I dressed with deliberate care, choosing a navy dress my father had once complimented, his words echoing faintly in my memory. You look like someone who belongs in command." My hands shook as I fastened the final button, the weight of the hidden ledger pressing in my mind. Daniel waited outside my door, steady and calm, his eyes silently urging me onward. Every step toward the boardroom felt like a step toward destiny, one I could no longer avoid. When we entered the boardroom, the air was suffocating with tension. The long mahogany table stretched before us, lined with faces I had known since childhood, my father's trusted partners, now older, weary, and wary. Margaret sat at the head of the table, poised like a queen awaiting her coronation. Ethan stood slightly behind her, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. Conversations hushed the moment I walked in, and I could feel every pair of eyes turning toward me. Some softened with sympathy, others hardened with doubt, and a few glimmered with curiosity, waiting to see if I would crumble or rise. Margaret began the meeting with her usual authority, her voice smooth and commanding. "We are gathered here to decide the future of Caldwell Enterprises," she said, her words carrying a finality that seemed to assume the outcome was already hers. She spoke of tradition, stability, and her decades of experience, painting herself as the natural heir to leadership. "Chloe," she added with a slight sneer, "has her youth and passion, of course, but passion without wisdom leads only to ruin." The words cut through me, but I clenched my fists under the table, refusing to show weakness. Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "With respect, Mrs. Caldwell, passion is not Chloe's only strength. She has vision, resilience, and most importantly, she carries the trust her father placed in her." His defense startled a few members, drawing murmurs around the table. Margaret's eyes narrowed, her smile tightening, but she remained outwardly composed. "Vision," she replied coolly, "is only as good as its execution. And in matters of business, loyalty and results speak louder than sentiment." She glanced at Ethan, who remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor, betraying an internal war I could almost feel radiating from him. My heart pounded as the moment I had dreaded finally arrived. Margaret concluded her speech with a flourish, her voice dripping with triumph. "Therefore I nominate myself as the new chair of Caldwell Enterprises." A few members nodded, their expressions resigned, as though convinced resistance was futile. But before the vote could be cast, I stood, my legs trembling yet unyielding. "Before we make any decisions," I said, my voice carrying more strength than I thought possible, "there is something you all need to see." The room fell silent, all eyes swinging toward me. Margaret's face darkened, suspicion sparking in her gaze. Slowly, I retrieved the ledger from my bag and placed it on the table. The air shifted instantly. Whispers rippled through the room, and even Margaret leaned forward slightly, though her composure never broke. "This," I said, opening the worn leather cover, "was my father's private record of company dealings. In it, he detailed financial discrepancies that were never meant to see the light of day." Gasps erupted as I turned to a marked page, revealing rows of figures, signatures, and hidden transfers. Funds moved off record, accounts siphoned into names that were not his, names that in fact belonged to Margaret Caldwell. For the first time, I saw Margaret falter. Her smile tightened, but her eyes blazed with barely concealed fury. "This is absurd," she snapped, her voice sharper now. "A grieving girl clinging to lies, misinterpreting records she doesn't understand." But the board members were already leaning closer, their expressions changing from doubt to shock as they scanned the evidence. Ethan shifted uneasily, his lips parting as though he wanted to speak, but he remained silent. I met his eyes for a fleeting moment, silently begging him to find his courage. There was truth in those pages, and he knew it. Daniel stepped in again, his voice steady as steel. "The numbers don't lie. These entries reveal a pattern, one that points directly to systematic embezzlement. If Chloe hadn't brought this forward, how long would this deception have continued?" The murmurs grew louder, some members exchanging furious looks, others glancing at Margaret with open suspicion. Margaret slammed her hand against the table, her mask of control cracking. "Enough!" she barked. "This charade ends now. Chloe, you have no idea what you're playing with." Her voice, once calculated and measured, now rang with desperation, and the room felt electric with the unraveling of her power. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling but unwavering. "You're right, Aunt Margaret. I didn't know at first. I didn't understand what these pages meant, but my father did, and he kept them hidden because he knew the truth would come out one day. That day is today." Silence fell, heavy and unbreakable, as the weight of my words settled over the room. Margaret glared at me, her face contorted with rage, and something else I couldn't quite name. Fear. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted. The storm had begun, and I was no longer standing in its path. I was commanding it. The silence in the boardroom stretched painfully long after my declaration, every eye fixed on Margaret, waiting for her rebuttal. For a moment, I feared she would laugh it off, dismiss me entirely, and twist the truth with her usual cunning. But instead, her lips pressed into a thin line, her nostrils flared, and her fingers dug into the polished mahogany as though she were clawing for control. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I held my ground, refusing to blink or back down. Then, out of nowhere, Ethan pushed his chair back with a screech that echoed like thunder. His voice, raw and shaking, sliced through the heavy silence. "She's telling the truth," he said. The words struck the room like a lightning bolt. Every head turned toward Ethan, disbelief flooding the faces of the board members. Margaret's head snapped toward him, her eyes widening in pure fury, the veneer of calm finally cracking. "Ethan," she hissed, "sit down, now." But he didn't. He stood taller, his hands trembling at his sides, his face pale yet resolute. "I can't anymore," he whispered, and then louder, with growing strength. "I can't keep covering for you, Margaret. Chloe deserves to know the truth. They all deserve to know." His confession sent ripples of shock around the table, whispers breaking into gasps. Margaret's voice lashed out, sharp as a whip. "You ungrateful coward," she spat, her voice rising higher than I had ever heard it before. "Everything I've done for this family, for this company, and you dare betray me now?" Ethan flinched at her venom, but he didn't retreat. His eyes found mine, and in them I saw both shame and liberation. "Your father suspected her for years," Ethan said, his words trembling but unwavering. "He confronted her once, before he died. But Margaret manipulated the board, silenced anyone who doubted her, and made sure his concerns never reached you." My heart pounded violently, the truth unraveling like threads pulled from an old tapestry. Daniel leaned forward, his voice careful yet urgent. "Ethan, if what you're saying is true, then these records aren't just numbers. They're proof of betrayal." Ethan nodded, swallowing hard, tears threatening to surface. "I signed some of those transfers," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Not because I wanted to, but because Margaret forced me to. She said it was for the company, to protect it from outsiders, to keep the power within the family. I believed her, or maybe I was too weak to resist. But I can't lie anymore." The boardroom erupted in chaos, voices overlapping, outrage and disbelief colliding in a storm of sound. Margaret slammed her fist onto the table, the noise silencing the room instantly. Her face flushed red, her composure shattered. She looked less like the untouchable matriarch and more like a cornered predator. "You pathetic fool," she spat at Ethan. "Do you think they'll forgive you? Do you think Chloe will? You've signed away your future by opening your mouth." Ethan trembled, but his gaze never left mine. "I don't want forgiveness," he said softly. "I just want the truth to finally be known." His words struck me deeper than I expected, igniting both anger at his complicity and pity for his torment. I rose to my feet, my voice carrying the weight of years of silence finally breaking. "So this is what it has all come down to. Lies, manipulation, and betrayal hidden under the guise of family loyalty." My eyes moved from Ethan to Margaret, my anger burning but controlled. "You used my father's trust, his company, his legacy, all for your own greed. And you," I said, turning to Ethan, my voice shaking with emotion, "you let her. You could have spoken up before, but you didn't. You let me walk into this fire blind." The board members were riveted, their faces pale, the truth binding them in stunned silence. Ethan's eyes filled with tears, his voice cracking. "You're right. I failed you. I failed him. I was too afraid of what she could do, too afraid of losing everything. But losing myself was worse. I can't carry it anymore, Chloe. I can't." His vulnerability sliced through me, stirring emotions I didn't expect. Anger, yes, but also sorrow, grief for the boy I once called my cousin, who had been twisted into silence by fear. For the first time, Margaret looked rattled, not just angry but desperate, her power slipping like sand through clenched fists. "Don't listen to him," she barked. "He's weak, spineless, He doesn't know what he's saying." But the board members no longer looked convinced. Their murmurs grew louder, their eyes darting between the ledger and Ethan, between Margaret's fury and my resolve. One of the elder members, Mr. Harrison, cleared his throat, his voice carrying the weight of decades of loyalty to my father. "If these records are accurate," he said gravely, "then what has been done is not just unethical, it is criminal." His words landed heavily, and the atmosphere shifted again. No longer just a family feud, but a reckoning with consequences far beyond the room. Margaret's face paled, her mask slipping further with each passing second. I steadied my breath, my voice cutting through the noise with calm conviction. This isn't just about numbers or titles. It's about truth. It's about restoring what my father built with integrity. Margaret, you wanted control at any cost, but that cost has been paid in deceit and stolen trust. And Ethan, your confession doesn't erase the past, but maybe, just maybe, it opens the door to something better than silence. The room quieted. Every face turned toward me, the tide of power finally shifting in my direction. For the first time since my father's death, I felt him near, as though his spirit stood behind me, steadying my shoulders. The board members leaned back, whispering among themselves, weighing the evidence laid bare before them. Margaret glared at me with a venom so potent it chilled the air, but beneath it, I saw fear, raw, undeniable fear. Ethan sank back into his chair, drained but unburdened, his confession leaving him hollow yet free. I knew then that the battle was far from over. Margaret was not the kind of woman to surrender quietly, but something had cracked today, something irreversible. For the first time, the truth was not whispered in shadows, but spoken aloud in light, and that truth was my weapon, sharp and unrelenting, ready for the war that was still to come. The boardroom felt like a battlefield, the air heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. Margaret sat rigid in her chair, her eyes darting from face to face, calculating who still remained on her side. Her carefully built empire of control had begun to crumble, brick by brick, and yet she clung to the remnants with every ounce of venom in her body. I could feel the tremor of the moment, the power shifting ever so slightly toward me, though the fight was far from won. My heart pounded in my chest, but I steadied my breathing, remembering my father's lessons about composure. He used to say, "A leader who loses her calm, loses the room." I wasn't going to lose. Not now. Margaret's voice broke the silence, dripping with venomous confidence. "You think you've won something here?" she hissed. "This," she gestured at the ledger, at Ethan slouched in defeat, "is nothing more than half-truths and desperate fabrications. Chloe, you're naive if you believe this makes you fit to lead. You have no idea the lengths it takes to keep this company alive." Her words were sharp, calculated to belittle me in front of the board. But this time, her tone cracked under the weight of desperation. Everyone heard it. She wasn't unshakable anymore, and that realization rippled through the room. Daniel leaned forward, his calm voice cutting across the tension like a blade. "Margaret, you've manipulated this family long enough. Chloe's father entrusted this company to be run with honor, not hidden deals and falsified transfers. These records speak for themselves." Margaret's lip curled, her eyes narrowing at him as though she could burn him to ashes with a glance. "You think you're clever, Daniel? But you're nothing more than her lapdog," she spat. Daniel didn't flinch, his calm composure only serving to make her appear more unhinged. I glanced at him, gratitude flooding me for his presence. He wasn't just an ally, he was the anchor that kept me from drowning in Margaret's storm. Ethan shifted uneasily, his guilt still written plainly across his face. "There's more," he said, his voice trembling. Margaret whipped her head toward him, eyes blazing with the fury of betrayal. "Don't you dare." But Ethan continued, his words spilling like a dam breaking. "The foreign accounts, the ones father suspected years ago, they exist." Margaret used shell companies, redirected profits, and made it appear as if the money was vanishing into taxes and losses. But it wasn't. It was being funneled straight into her control. Gasps echoed across the room, the shock undeniable. Margaret's face twisted, no longer just anger but pure panic. One of the senior board members, Mrs. Callahan, stood, her voice trembling but resolute. "If this is true, then Margaret has defrauded every one of us, every shareholder, every employee who has placed their trust in this company." Her words rang with the finality of judgment, and for the first time, Margaret faltered visibly, her shoulders sagging. The sight of her unraveling was both exhilarating and terrifying. For so long, she had been the immovable force in my life, the shadow over every choice I tried to make. To see her crack was like watching a fortress collapse from within. But I knew better than to think she would go down quietly. Margaret suddenly stood, slamming her chair back with a violent screech that made several people flinch. Her voice rose, shrill and furious. "You think you can strip this from me? From me? I've carried this company on my back for years while the rest of you sat idle, basking in the comfort I provided. You wouldn't have your precious dividends without me. You wouldn't even have jobs. And now you dare to condemn me?" Her chest heaved, her eyes wild, and in that moment, she looked less like a leader and more like someone on the verge of madness. The room froze, stunned by her unraveling. I rose to my feet, my voice steady but burning with fire. "You carried nothing, Margaret. You stole, you deceived, and you crushed anyone who stood in your way, but not anymore. Your reign ends here." The words spilled from me with a force I didn't know I had, my voice echoing in the stunned silence. Margaret's glare locked on me, her hatred searing, but I didn't flinch. I stood taller, shoulders back, channeling every ounce of strength my father had ever instilled in me. For the first time, I wasn't his grieving daughter or Margaret's pawn. I was Chloe Hartman, and I was claiming my place. The board began murmuring, louder this time, their voices growing in strength. I caught fragments. "She's right. Too much evidence. This cannot stand." Margaret's fury flickered into fear as she realized her grip was slipping faster than she could claw it back. "This isn't over," she spat, her voice low and venomous, directed only at me. "You think you've exposed me, but you have no idea the depths of what I've done. You'll regret this, Chloe. Mark my words." Her threat sent a chill down my spine, but I refused to let it show. I met her stare with unyielding resolve. "Then let's finish this in the light, not the shadows." Ethan buried his face in his hands, tears slipping through his fingers as the weight of his confession crushed him. I wanted to be angry, and part of me was, but another part ached for him, because he had lived so long under Margaret's control that he barely knew who he was anymore. The board's voices grew louder, firmer, calling for a vote, for an immediate investigation. Margaret's face paled as she realized the walls were closing in. I looked around the room, at the people who once doubted me, and saw in their eyes the first spark of belief. It was fragile, but it was real. The tide had turned, and for the first time, victory felt within reach. The vote was called sooner than I expected, the board members' voices carrying the weight of finality as they declared their decision. One by one, hands were raised, first tentatively, then with more conviction. The motion to suspend Margaret pending investigation passed almost unanimously, with only one wavering soul too afraid to defy her. The room erupted into murmurs, but Margaret's shriek cut through the noise, a sound so piercing it made my chest tighten. "You fools! Do you think Chloe has the strength to lead you? Do you even know who she is?" Her eyes burned into me with a hatred I had never known possible, as if every failure she had suffered was suddenly my fault. Yet I stood rooted, refusing to crumble under her last desperate attempt at control. Margaret lunged toward the table, slamming her fist against the polished wood with a force that rattled the pens and papers scattered across it. "You've all made a mistake you'll regret. This company was never built on integrity. It was built on power. And power doesn't change hands with a vote. Chloe isn't your savior. She's your executioner." The venom in her words was meant to sow fear, to fracture the board's unity, but it only highlighted her unraveling. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself slightly between us, his protective stance both comforting and emboldening. For a fleeting moment, I saw the girl I once was, the one who used to tremble in Margaret's presence, and realized she no longer existed. Ethan finally lifted his head, his face streaked with tears, but his voice steadier than before. "She's wrong," he said, looking directly at me. "Chloe is the only one who can undo the damage. I should have spoken sooner, but I was afraid." Margaret made us all afraid. His words silenced the room, their sincerity undeniable, and the shame in his tone cut deeper than any accusation. Margaret's face twisted, horror dawning on her as her last ally broke away from her. She hissed Ethan's name, a warning, but it fell flat. The dam had burst, and there was no salvaging the pieces. Security was summoned, and though Margaret fought, thrashing, clawing, screaming accusations that bordered on incoherence, She was eventually escorted from the room. Watching her being dragged away was a surreal moment, both terrifying and liberating. She cursed me until the very last second, her voice echoing down the hall like the dying cries of a wounded animal. When the doors finally closed, the silence that followed was deafening. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my knees trembling as the adrenaline drained from me. For the first time in years, the shadow had lifted, but it left behind an ache I couldn't yet name. The board reconvened, and this time, the voices that once doubted me now carried an unexpected respect. They turned to me not as the girl who once hid behind Margaret's control, but as the woman who had stood against her and revealed the truth. "Chloe, Mrs. Callahan said softly, "It seems the company has found its rightful heir." Her words sent a surge of emotion through me, relief, grief, and determination all at once. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but the chains that bound me to Margaret's cruelty had finally been broken. And now, for the first time, the fight was no longer about survival. It was about building something better. The following days were a blur of meetings, statements, and endless paperwork, yet the image of Margaret being dragged from the boardroom stayed lodged in my mind like a splinter. At night, I would lie awake replaying her words, her face twisted in fury, the venom of her voice declaring me unworthy. But what unsettled me more than her hatred was the emptiness that followed. Margaret had been my tormentor, yes, but she was also the force I had lived against, the wall I had spent years trying to climb. Without her shadow looming over me, I felt both free and disoriented, like a bird that had flown out of its cage only to realize it no longer knew where home was. Mason slept beside me, his hand always finding mine in the dark, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this uncharted territory, but the weight of leadership pressed heavier than I ever imagined. It wasn't until the auditor's final report arrived that the true magnitude of Margaret's betrayal came to light. Buried in the shareholder records and masked by decades of deliberate obfuscation, she had siphoned millions into shell companies under different names. But the most shocking discovery was that one of those names was my father's. The very man I had been told abandoned us had been used as a puppet in Margaret's schemes, his identity twisted into a weapon to cover her tracks. My chest tightened as the evidence was laid before me. Bank accounts, forged signatures, false ownership records. It became clear that Margaret had spent years rewriting not just the company's history, but my family's, manipulating the story to isolate me, to make me feel unworthy of belonging. In that moment, rage and grief merged, leaving me trembling as if the ground itself had shifted. At the next family gathering, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Every relative who once dismissed me now avoided my eyes, unsure of where they stood in the wake of Margaret's downfall. My Aunt Cecilia, the one who had stood and humiliated me in front of everyone weeks earlier, approached with trembling hands, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I didn't know. I truly didn't know what she had done." Her apology, though hesitant, was real, and for the first time, I realized they too had been trapped in Margaret's narrative, controlled by the lies she fed them. As I looked around the table, the same table where I was once told I'd never control this family business, I felt a strange sense of reclamation. I wasn't just inheriting a company, I was inheriting the truth, the painful, tangled truth of what had been stolen from me. And while the scars of betrayal would linger, they would no longer define me. When I finally stood to speak, my voice carried a strength I had never heard from myself before. "This company was built by more than one person's greed," I began, my eyes sweeping over the faces of cousins, uncles, and aunts, who now sat in stunned silence. "It was built on sacrifice, on hard work, on generations of sweat that Margaret tried to erase, but we will not let her rewrite us anymore." I paused, the words settling over the room like a quiet storm. "From this moment forward we rebuild, not on secrets, not on manipulation, but on truth. That is the inheritance we deserve, and the only one I am willing to protect." The silence that followed wasn't hostile this time. It was reverent, a recognition that something had shifted, not just within me, but within all of us. Later that night, alone in my office, I looked at the portrait of my grandfather that hung above the mantel. His stern eyes seemed softer now, as if even he had been waiting for this moment of reckoning. Tears welled in my eyes as I whispered, "It's over. It's finally over." For years I had believed my place in this family was conditional, that love and belonging could be revoked like shares in a ledger. But now I knew the truth. I didn't need Margaret's approval, or anyone else's, to define my worth. The business was mine not because of bloodlines or votes, but because I had stood when it mattered. I had faced the darkness when no one else dared. And in that victory, painful and imperfect, I found the thing I had been searching for all along. Not control, not power, but peace. If this story moved you, if you felt every twist, every betrayal, and every moment of strength, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you'll never miss the next powerful story, filled with raw emotions, shocking revelations, and unforgettable characters. Join us on this journey. Your support helps keep these stories alive.